Hello again. I'm Michael Hryschenko, and I'm the author and narrator of the Democracy Undecided channel, which explores democracies through simplicities, what democracies really means, and why they never settled. Today, we are going to review the framework that I have developed as the analytical foundation for the Democracy Undecided project, which aims to help audiences understand what democracies looks like in practice, what conditions sustain it, and how it changes over time. Rather than ranking countries or promoting political outcomes, the framework is designed to help readers and viewers and analyze their own systems to recognize equilibrium, detect drift, and understand why certain patterns repeat across very different societies. This framework emerges from repeated attempts to explain democracy without reducing it to slogans, moral claims, or ideological positions. Public debate about democracy often collapses into polarized narratives: success or failure, virtue or corruption, stability or collapse. These debates generate conviction but rarely understanding. What is usually missing is a simple structural way to see how democratic systems actually function under the pressure. The Hryschenko's democracy equilibrium framework is not an academic model in the formal sense, nor does it seek theoretical completeness. Its purpose is analytical clarity. The goal is to provide a small number of structural concepts that allow non-specialists to reason about democratic systems without requiring disciplinary training in political science, economics, or law. This work does not defend any country, ideology, or political system. It offers a way to think about democracy that is simple enough to be widely used, but precise enough to reveal why democracies stabilize, drift, or fail. This framework is a conceptual model developed for clarity and again public understanding, not a literature review or empirical academic paper. In this part, we will consider in detail the quality multipliers, which is the core environmental channels. We will have a look at the primary risks for democracies, and we will talk about the checks and balances and enforcements that exist in the democratic environment. So, formal democratic institutions alone do not determine how a democracy performs. Countries with similar constitutions, elections, and legal frameworks often produce radically different outcomes. The difference lies in equality multipliers, which are background conditions that amplify or distort how power is focused, translated, transmitted, and exercised within the system. These multipliers do not create power. They determine how efficiently existing power is converted into outcomes. High-quality multipliers increase a democracy's tolerance for pressure. Strong procedural norms channel citizen conflict into lawful process rather than street confrontation. High information integrity forces economic power to operate transparently rather than manipulatively. Capable institutions apply rules predictably, preventing discretionary escalation. Low-quality multipliers, by contrast, magnify instability. When norms reward outrage over procedure, citizen power fragments. When information integrity collapses, economic influence shifts from persuasion to narrative control. When institutions weaken, authority becomes selective and arbitrary. Under these conditions, even minor shocks can push the system far from equilibrium. Multipliers alone do not determine democratic survival, but they define how much stress a system can absorb before formal constraints are tested. To understand how democracies resist or fail under sustained pressure, we must now examine the mechanisms designed to restrain power once amplification turns into concentration. Institutional quality determines not how large the state is, but how power behaves under pressure. Laws do not enforce themselves. Enforcement depends on courts, regulators, and bureaucracies that are professional or supposed to be professional, independent, predictable, and capable. Where institutions are strong, government authority remains lawful, contestable, and reversible. And both political leaders and business actors remain constrained by real enforcement rather than symbolic rules. When institutions are weak, power does not disappear, it moves. In some cases, it leaks outward to capital through regulatory capture and policy dependence, producing oligarchic outcomes. In other instances, it leaks to the street as legitimacy erodes and enforcement fragments, creating disorder and informal power. But when executive authority is strong, while institutional constraints are weak, power collapses inward. The executive captures courts, regulators, media narratives, and economic actors, transforming formal authority into domination. Dictatorship does not emerge solely from the state strengths. It emerges when strength is no longer filtered through independent institutions, legislative oversight, and judicial enforcement. A state can be powerful on paper, yet hollow in practice, or powerful in practice, yet unchecked in law. In both cases, institutional failure converts democratic authority into either private capture or centralized control. Institutional quality is therefore not a separate force, but a multiplier of government power. It determines whether power is constrained or concentrated, reversible or locked in, lawful or arbitrary. Democracy becomes unstable when the state is strong. But when executive power escapes the institutional filter, that keeps it accountable. Cultural and social norms form the behavioral environment in which democracy operates. They are not additional force within the democracy equilibrium point, but a system-wide multiplier that shapes how citizens, businesses, and government use their formal powers. These norms determine whether rules are followed procedurally or emotionally, whether contracts are honored or casually violated, and whether corruption is resisted or normalized. Where norms favor procedural compliance, such as respect for law, tax payment, and lawful dispute resolution, democratic institutions function with relatively low friction. Where norms tolerate rule bending, informal enforcement, or opportunism, some formal institutions simultaneously lose effectiveness across all channels. This explains why countries with similar constitutions and legal frameworks can produce radically different outcomes. Culture does not replace institutions, it multiplies or undermines their effectiveness, shaping citizen restraints, business behavior, and governmental legitimacy simultaneously. Information integrity refers not merely to media pluralism, but to societal trust and that rules government operate, that courts adjudicate fairly, statistics reflect reality, elections matter, and laws are applied consistently. When information integrity is high, citizens remain procedural rather than radical. Business influence remains visible and contestable, and government authority stays legitimate. When it collapses, a predictable pattern emerges. Citizens radicalize, business manipulate narratives, and government centralize control to compensate for eroding trust. This multiplier is particularly dangerous because its erosion is often gradual and invisible. Once people stop believing that rules function, they stop complying voluntarily. At the moment, the democracy equilibrium point begins to unravel even if formal democratic institutions remain intact. Democratic systems rarely fail through sudden collapse. More often, they deform gradually as one internal force escapes constraints and begins to dominate the others, pulling the system away from democracy equilibrium point. From the citizen side, the risk is not participation, but polarization, apathy, misinformation, and mob dynamics, where political power becomes emotional rather than procedural. From the business side, the danger lies in capture, concentrated economic power converting quietly into political influence through lobbying, media ownership, and dependency. From the state, the risk is not strength, but escape, when executive authority normalizes emergency powers, captures courts, and bypasses legislative oversight. Each of these dynamics pull the system away from the democracy equilibrium point in a distinct direction, often while elections and formal institutions remain intact. Checks and balances are not a decorative feature. They are often political breaking system. We need checks on government, checks on business, and checks on citizens. Without all three, the equilibrium point becomes unstable. Democracy doesn't survive on good intentions. It survives on frictions and breaks. Governments must be constrained by courts, parliaments, and media. Businesses must be constrained by competition law, transparency, and regulators. And citizens must be constrained too by constitutions, procedures, and institutions that prevent emotional majorities from destroying the system in a single vote. In simple words, we can call them checks and balances, but in plain language it means this. The government must fear its citizens and the law. Big business must fear fair competition and transparency. And even the citizens must fear their own emotions and accept rules that stop them from destroying the system in one angry vote. Courts, parliaments, federalism, media, constitutions, regulator, this is the hardware that keeps the equilibrium point from sliding into the corner. Switzerland is a good example. Strong local powers, frequent votes, but also quite rigid rules on what can be changed and how. That's not decoration, that's the safety frame holding the political equilibrium in place. In this part of the video, we will consider path of democratic drift towards oligarchy, authoritarianism, and anarchic stringent political systems. Democratic equilibrium breaks down when one internal force escapes constraints and overwhelms the other two. When citizens' power detaches from procedural and institutions lose authority, politics shifts towards anarchy or populist autocracy. Rule driven by emotion, mobilization, and legitimacy claims rather than enforceable law. When business power dominates both government and society, democracy erodes into oligarchy or corporate capture, in which political outcomes serve concentrated extraction rather than public accountability. When government power escapes legislative oversight and judicial constraint, centralized authority expands in the name of stability, often sliding from soft authoritarianism into dictatorship. These outcomes are not sudden regime changes or ideological revolutions. They are gradual structural deformations, democracy transforming into something else, while elections, constitutions, and formal institutions, of course, may still appear. Democracies rarely drift away overnight. They erode gradually through a sequence of institutional and psychological shifts that move the system away from democracy equilibrium point. At the equilibrium point, power remains constrained, contestable, and reversible. Courts are independent, legislatures are active, the media is pluralistic, and opposition forces can realistically win elections. Conflict exists, but it is processed through procedures. The system corrects itself. Authoritarian drift usually begins with crisis framing. A permanent narrative of emergency, for example, security threats, chaos, internal or external enemies, all that justifies speed over procedure. Citizens accept exceptional measures because they are framed as temporary or necessary. At this stage, power is still formally reversible, but social tolerance for constraint weakens. Next comes the expansion of emergency or special regimes. Emergency laws, expanded policing, and restrictions on protest, assembly, and speech concentrate power in the executive branch. These powers are theoretically temporary, but in practice they weaken legislative oversight and judicial enforcement. The short-term judicial filter begins to fail, and reversibility becomes conditional. The system then enters an illiberal democracy. Elections continue to exist and may still be competitive, but civil liberties are weakened, the media is pressured, and courts are politically attacked or delegitimized. The democratic form remains, but the balance of constraint is breaking. Reversibility exists in theory, but not reliably in practice. As drift continues, the system becomes competitive authoritarian. The executive dominates the legislature, judicial independence is reduced or ignored, and elections remain formally open but increasingly predictable. Opposition still exists, but under constant legal, administrative, and informational pressure. Reversibility now depends on regime tolerance rather than institutional force. In an electoral autocracy, elections turn into procedural rituals. Opposition is neutralized through prosecution, exclusion, or disqualification. Media and civil society are tightly controlled. Democratic institutions still exist on paper, but power is no longer meaningfully contestable. Reversibility is effectively lost. At full dictatorship, power becomes irreversible. No effective opposition exists. Law no longer constrains power. It serves it. The democracy equilibrium point collapses entirely. In some cases, this culminates in ideological dictatorship, a totalitarian subtype marked by mass mobilization ideology. The state fuses political power, security apparatus, media narratives, and identity. Control is maintained not only through repression, but also through enforced participation and ideological conformity. The critical insight is that democracy becomes unstable not when the state is strong, but when executive power escapes legislative oversight and judicial enforcement. Authoritarianism advances not through sudden rupture, but through normalized exceptions, institutional capture, and gradual loss of reversibility, often while democratic forms remain intact. Now let's have a look at the oligarchic drift and actually how democracy empties without falling. The oligarchic drift represents the gradual displacement of democratic equilibrium by concentrated economic power. Democracies rarely collapse through abrupt seizure of power. Instead, they erode step by step as economic power concentrates first, then captures policy, and eventually captures the state itself. At the democracy equilibrium point, economic power is diffused and contestable. Businesses compete and can fail, citizens influence markets through consumption and labor choices, and the state enforces competition, labor standards, and transparency. Political authority is not structurally dependent on large capital. The drift begins when markets consolidate, mergers, scale advantages, and networked effects give large firms structural dominance over smaller competitors. Entry barriers rise through capital intensity, regulatory complexity, and technological advantage. Inequality of economic power grows faster than democratic mechanisms can correct. As concentration increases, pressure for regulatory capture intensifies. Lobbying expands, revolving doors form between regulators and industry, and regulation becomes complex in a way that favor incumbents. Enforcement weakens asymmetrically. Rules apply more strictly to small actors, while large ones gain flexibility or exemptions. Over time, governments become fiscally and politically dependent on major economic actors. Too big to fail, logic emerges, and threats of capital flight, job losses, or financial instability begin to shape policy. At this stage, democracy equilibrium point drift towards business influence over government. The system then enters an illiberal market democracy. Elections remain competitive, but the range of acceptable policy narrows. Certain economic outcomes become effectively non-negotiable. Labor protections weakens in the name of competitiveness, media ownership concentrates, and dominant narratives align with economic interests. As drift continues, oligarchic governance emerges. A small group of firms or individuals dominates key sectors. Political access becomes unequal and transactional. Courts still function, but litigation power is asymmetric. Citizens remain formal rights, but their ability to influence outcomes declines sharply. In an entrenched oligarchy, economic power becomes closed or hereditary. Competition is structurally blocked, and policy outcomes reliably favor elite interests. Democratic correction through elections alone becomes ineffective. The democracy equilibrium point collapses. Equilibrium is no longer reachable through democratic means. In its final form, oligarchy often fuses with executive power, producing oligarchic authoritarian hybrids. Economic elites align with a strong executive, political repression protests economic dominance, and media courts and security institutions reinforce elite control. Citizens are reduced to consumers rather than political actors. Democratic systems may fail through a distinct but equally destructive pathway, anarchic drift. Unlike authoritarian or oligarchic erosion, anarchic drift occurs not when power concentrates, but when legitimate authority dissolves. Near the democracy equilibrium point, state authority is limited yet enforceable. Laws are broadly accepted and complied with, institutions are trusted to resolve conflict, and markets operate under predictable rules. Stability in this zone depends less on coercion than on voluntarily compliance grounded in legitimacy. Anarchic drift begins with the erosion of institutional trust. Citizens lose confidence in courts, police, and equal enforcement of the law, often following corruption scandals, selective justice, or persistent governance failure. Legal compliance becomes conditional rather than normative. As trust erodes further, authority itself is delegitimized. Laws are increasingly viewed as unjust or arbitrary. Elections lose credibility and are seen as ineffective. Direct action logic begins to replace institutional channels and citizens disengage from formal political participation. This leads to selective law obedience. Individuals and groups comply with only with rules they personally accept. Law becomes negotiable rather than binding. Informal norms replace formal legal frameworks, and parallel systems of labor, justice, and enforcement emerge. At this stage, the democracy equilibrium point drifts towards citizen dominance over the state. Social order then fragments. Protests become permanent and unstructured, contracts and property rights weaken, and vigilantism, private security, and self-help justice expand. Economic coordination deteriorates alongside institutional coherence. Only after legitimacy has collapsed does state capacity begin to fail. Police and courts become unable or unwilling to enforce law. Tax compliance collapses, public services degrade, and political authority becomes largely symbolic. Power disperses to fiction, networks, and local actors. In the final stage, effective anarchy emerges. No actor retains a monopoly on legitimate force. Authority is fragmented rather than absent, law becomes unpredictable or disappears entirely, and citizens rely on kinship groups, gangs, militas, or private protection. The democracy equilibrium point collapses completely, replaced by disorder. Anarchy, however, is rarely stable. It frequently produces violent reordering as societies trade freedom for security and invite authoritarian restoration. Thus, anarchic drift does not represent excess democracy, but the terminal consequences of legitimacy collapse, often resetting the system toward dictatorship or warlordism, rather than restoring equilibrium. This slide integrates the entire framework we discussed previously into a single macro-political model. The framework does not judge values or ideologies. It tracks control dynamics. Democracy can be analytically understood as a dynamic equilibrium system governed by the interaction of three internal forces: citizens, business, and government. The democracy equilibrium point, DEP, represents a narrow zone in which these forces mutually constrain one another, keeping power contestable, limited, and reversible. Democratic stability does not depend on ideological consensus, institutional perfection, or social harmony, but on the preservation of this balance. Deviation from the DEP does not occur randomly, nor does it typically involve abrupt institutional collapse. Instead, democracies drift along identifiable trajectories when one internal force gains structural dominance over the others. These deviations form a spectrum of macro-political dynamics in which formal democratic institutions such as elections, courts, constitutions may persist even as equilibrium erodes beneath them. When government power escapes constraints, democratic systems tend to drift toward authoritarianism through crisis framing, emergency powers, and the gradual concentration of executive authority. When business power overwhelms political and civil constraints, democracies drift towards oligarchy as economic concentration translates into policy capture and unequal political access. When citizen power overwhelms institutional authority, the system drifts toward anarchy through erosion of legitimacy, selective law obedience, and fragmentation of social order. These paths are distinct but structurally comparable. In each case, democracy fails not through ideological extremism, but through imbalance. The critical variable is not which actor holds power, but whether any actor becomes immune to constraint. Democratic collapse is therefore best understood not as a binary event, but as a movement along a deviation spectrum away from democracy equilibrium point. So, as a conclusion, we can say democracy is not a static system. It is a moving equilibrium, stable only as long as no force becomes untouchable. So, in the next video, we will consider short-term judicial and long-term legislative filters. So, see you in the next one.